Welcome to a new episode of Books to Last. This episode, I'm joined by Doug Robertson, aka The Weird Teacher, as he shares his 5 books he would take with him when cast away to a mystery remote location. This episode may contain spoilers, so please check the episode description for a list of the books discussed. Hello and welcome to Books to Last, a podcast that challenges readers to pick the only 5 books they can take with them when cast away to a mystery remote location. As ever, I'm joined by a book-loving guest, and this episode I'm joined by Doug. Doug, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself to the listener?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to do this, except for as soon as I said yes, I panicked and could not think of any books at all, and then thought of too many books. My name is Doug Robertson. I'm a 5th grade teacher in the United States, on the west coast of the United States. And I'm also an author. I've written 5 books, most of them about education, and one about a post-apocalyptic motorcycle gang, because man cannot live on education alone. I've loved reading since I was a very small person. It was always just the thing that I could go do whenever I wanted to do. And there's actually a book that I'm going to talk about that made me realize how important reading and specifically specific authors are to me. And all of that also comes from, for the longest time, I was a frustrated author. That was like, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a rock star or an author. And that never really seemed like a thing I could do until I one day just kind of decided, I'll just write a book and nobody reads it and I don't care, because at least I wrote a book.
Yes.
So, and all of that came from just a love of words and a love of books. And there are my dogs.
Absolutely fine. We love dogs on the podcast. So a lot of people don't necessarily understand the amount of love and labor that needs to go into producing a book, or maybe they do, and that's why so many people talk themselves out of writing one. I used to want to be a writer when I was younger, because I always loved reading, but I don't know what I did to talk myself out of pursuing it. It's something that still sort of niggles in the back of my mind when I'm off doing my my regular job, and I'm like, but I could be not doing this.
That blank page is scary.
Definitely. I feel it about everything, even when I'm writing things for work, when I'm writing things for my studies. It's just like, most of the time it's just doing a cover page to try and not have a blank page to start from. But yeah, but congratulations on writing. I mean, 5 books. I love the part where you pause, like you couldn't read so many books, you couldn't remember how many.
You kind of forget. I think it's 5.
I like the range of educational work, but also motorcycle gangs. Like it. It's great. Reading was a big part of me. I feel like that's not always a common thread. I like it when I meet someone people who get to reading, I suppose, later on, but reading is sort of always quite a formative process to go through. It's quite nice to hear how that helps people go and do things. So yeah. So what was the last great book you read? Are you reading anything good at the moment?
Oh my gosh. I wish I had an answer that sounded really fancy and like, oh wow, he's really impressive. I actually just discovered this manga called Chainsaw Man that is so much fun. It is this, and I mean this in the most respectful, happy way. It is the best mix of the Japanese culture of media that they do so well, where like it is bonkers ridiculous. Like Chainsaw Man is literally about a guy who turns into a chainsaw. Chainsaws sprout from his face and his arms. That is what it's about. So it's ridiculous. But also it's like the main character grew up poor and he had nothing. So his whole journey is about like, oh, I can actually I can have dreams. Like in the first book, he gets to eat a bento box and he's like, I've never had a bento box. This is amazing. This is the greatest thing that has ever happened to me. And his dreams slowly get bigger and bigger and bigger over the course of the book. So it's like a 1 minute he's fighting a giant bat demon with his face. And then the next minute, like, it's this really heartfelt scene about him understanding the breadth that he could accomplish and that he could want. And it's I really like that kind of bonkers intersection of things.
It's always the ones that surprise you. I think I find the ones that have like those titles or premises where people just like go what,
Yeah.
but then they really sneak up on you, because then they have this like kind of incognito ability to be really meaningful and poignant in ways that you wouldn't expect them to be, when something has something like a name so on the nose like Chainsaw Man.
That's some of my favorite media is looks stupid but is sneakily very smart. Like, my
Yeah.
favorite movie in the world is Pacific Rim, not to get off on a tangent, but Pacific Rim
Yeah.
is Guillermo del Toro movie about giant robots fighting giant monsters. But it's actually about the power of empathy and humans coming together to save the world. And it's like, oh, I love stuff like that. It's so good.
It's great, yeah. So, I mean, that gives us a little taste of the kind of books that we might be hearing about later on in the podcast. But as ever, our guest gets to pick where they are cast away to. Do you have a particular place in mind you would like to be cast away to with your books?
The one that jumps immediately to mind is Maui. I lived on Oahu. I lived on the main island of Hawaii for about 6 or 7 years, and I absolutely loved it. But if I had to pick an island, Oahu's a little too populous. Maui still has stuff. It's not like Molokai where there's nothing. There's stuff on Maui, but it's not overpopulated. It's not ridiculous. But I love the beach. I love to surf. At least I used to love to surf when I lived there. Now I would probably just bob in the ocean. But whatever, that's still a good day. So if I
Sounds
had
like a
to
good
pick
day.
somewhere, it would some island location, like where there's no snow. My idea of a
Sounds
perfect Christmas is no snow.
sounds glorious. That is a hot take, or a cold take, I suppose, depending on what side you're coming at it from. But yeah, I'm very much as someone who has no balance, no discernible center of gravity, and is terrible at all sports. I like the idea of surfing. I know I would be terrible at it.
But it's one of those things that you can suck at, and it's still
It's still
so
fun.
much fun.
I mean, that's reassuring. So if I ever want to give it a go, if I go somewhere, I can still potentially have fun whilst not being very good at it. Another sport I can add to my repertoire of sports I'm not good at. Well, now that we've got the location, I suppose we can just dive straight into your 5 books. What is your first book that you're going to be taking with you?
So the first book, and probably, I don't know if it's the most, it's an incredibly important book to me. It's called Small Gods by Terry Pratchett.
Oh,
And
fun!
it's a Discworld book because it's a Terry Pratchett book. But it is kind of removed from 99% of the Discworld stories. There's not really anybody in Small Gods that shows up in any of the other books. And my favorite character I love all the Discworld books. My favorite character is Sam Vimes, who has a million books. And he's not in Small Gods, but Small Gods, I think, is the first Discworld book that I ever read. And it kind of cemented that world for me very, very quickly of like, oh, this is, and kind of like what we were saying, this is incredibly funny, but also super deep. Like he has so much to say while it's a story about a very simple man and a talking turtle. So it's great, and it's so I think it embodies kind of the Discworld ethic of you can whip a little message on somebody while having a good time. And are we supposed to give a summary of the book if
I
you
was
want?
going to say, for anyone who hasn't heard of it, so I read Small Gods, the graphic novel, last year, and
Oh,
loved it so much. I haven't read the proper one. When I finished the graphic novel, I was like, I've got Small Gods in paperback that I'm going to read this year, because I knew I had to read the full text, because the graphic novel alone was so funny and it was so well adapted that I was like, I need to read this. But for the benefit of any listeners who aren't familiar with the story, what briefly, and I know it's probably a difficult one to narrow down, what briefly is Small Gods about?
I didn't know there was a graphic novel. I'm gonna have to hunt that down.
It's so good as well. It does something different than any graphic novel. I've never seen a graphic novel adapted the way that one is. It's so clever.
So the basic concept of Small Gods and the world of the gods in Discworld is the more believers you have, the more powerful you are as a god. And so the god Om has a lot of followers who say they worship Om. But Om wakes up one day and Om is a very small, very weak turtle. Because even though there's this entire culture of people who say they worship and believe in Om, there is only one man who actually really believes in him. And so the journey is Om getting over his ego of, I'm the greatest god in the world, and realizing, oh, I'm nothing without the people who love me.
Yeah.
And Brada, who is the one person who believes in Om, kind of helping him see that. It's kind of like, I guess, if you wanted to. My 3-year-old is crying right
It's
now.
okay. If you want
Now,
to,
as I explain it, it's kind of like the Emperor's New Groove, where like Pacha is trying to teach the Emperor some humility. It's a little bit
yeah,
like that. But it's just so much fun. And like the take on religion is really good. I think it's very interesting. Um,
yeah, that was the thing that I took away from. I think the messages it has to say about like society were interesting. I really liked the sort of dichotomy of the literal, a god could literally fall to the ground and even and no one would believe them.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
That they were who they said they were, and it was very, like I say, very funny, but also, yeah, my vibe for Terry Pratchett has always been, he's got a lot of message behind his stories, but if you want to turn your brain off and just go along for the fun ride, you can very much not listen to the rest of it, but I feel like you get a lot more out of it when you do.
Yeah, absolutely. He's the best. I have more to say about him because he comes up again later.
Well, we can save it for later. But the first book, Small Gods by Terry Pratchett, great start to the list. What is the second book you want to take with you?
The second book is the book that, you know how people ask like, what's your favorite book, and that's an impossible question. This
Yeah.
is the answer that I give most of the time. It's Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke.
Not one I've heard of.
So Childhood's End is about the end of the world. It's about so these it's kind of like the beginning of Independence Day is like the beginning of Childhood's End, but only briefly. These giant spaceships show up over Earth and they just hover over Earth and they don't make contact for a very, very long period of time. And then suddenly they start talking. And rather than destroying the planet, they solve wars and they solve disease and they make humanity incredibly comfortable and happy, and everything gets better. And then after, I think it's 50 or 100 years, like they get it's a book that takes place over a really long time period. The overlords, as they're called, finally say, okay, we're going to come down so you can actually meet us. And when they walk out of their spaceships, they look like the normal description of the devil. So they've got horns and they've got a spiked tail and they've got wings, but they have been around for so long that humanity is able to go, oh, that we're going to get over what they look like because they're so helpful. And then the arc of the book is the overlords are really there because humanity is reaching its next stage of evolution, and the next generation of children are evolving beyond what would quote unquote be humans. So it's literally Childhood's End, like our kind of humans are ending. Humanity as we know it is over, but the next stage of evolution of humans is continuing on. And it's just, I love everything that it has to say about Clarke is another one that just has so much to say in all of his books. It has a lot to say about society and preconceived notions and where we can go as a people if we just wanted to. If we all decided this is a thing that we could do. And I really think it's a beautiful book, even though the end of the book is literally the last human dying.
Oh.
But it's like a beautiful thing rather than a sad thing.
Yeah. Well, it's something that undoubtedly is going to happen eventually, so nice to...
And it's also great hard science fiction. You know, Clarke is one of those science fiction authors where if he says we're going to fly to this star and it's going to take 250 years, and you looked up the star in a star chart, that star is there. And if you did the math, it would take 250 years. And I just really like that kind of deep, like him and Asimov, that deep level of nerdiness.
Yeah. People who take the science part of science fiction quite seriously. I mean, I don't think it's like necessary in all science fiction, but I do really appreciate the sort of research and care of authors who like to do that research before they set a book in that particular sort of area. I suppose I like that kind of diligence to, I'm gonna really base it in science, as opposed to some people sometimes enter the science fiction and fantasy genre and sort of think that they don't need to have rules or worlds that make sense because it's sci-fi and fantasy. And I kind of, it's like, worlds with magic systems that aren't really magic systems because they just say whatever suits the needs of the story is what it is. Which I don't know. I do like it when there's kind of cogs and mechanisms and research
when it
and all
feels
that sort of
a
stuff
little bit based in reality. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like, I love Star Trek. I know that warp speed is the speed of plot, and however long it takes to get there is how long it needs to take to get there. But I also like it when it's like, no, it's going to take this long because this is how fast we can go.
Yeah. It's good. I people, to be fair, people tend to dislike plot-based sort of narrative decisions when it's not the way they want the story to go. So, so it's all perspective. But Charlton End, it's not a book that I've heard of, but again, very I like the hidden meanings behind what can, on the face of it, seem like sort of just straight up sci-fi and fantasy. I like the commentary behind that. It's always really good, and that sounds really interesting. Some very didactic stories coming out. I wonder if all of the books are going to follow the same sort of trend.
It was weird because I wanted to be like, I'm going to pick Othello because it's my favorite Shakespeare play, and I want people to think I'm smart. But then I was like, but that's not really, like, if you had to pick 5 books, that's not one that you would pick.
Yeah, it's definitely, I very much encourage anyone who comes into the podcast to just like really just like pick the ones that they really, really love, because like it's very much, I'm kind of like that. I have all-time favorite books that I bring out when I want to sound impressive and people ask for a good recommendation and I want to sound smart. And then I've got other ones where I'm like, no, but you would actually, this is a favorite book of mine and you would actually really love this. And then if I was but it's one of those things, it changes. I think changes with circumstance, changes with time, depends what I'm reading more recently as well, sometimes changes my thoughts on it. So it can moderate, but this very much like is just books that you love reading over and over again. So what is the third book that you would be adding to this list?
So the third book is a biography. It's a collection of journals called Get in the Van by Henry Rollins. Rollins is, and he's not anymore, but he was the frontman for a famous punk band in America called Black Flag. And he journaled obsessively when he was young. He still does it. But Get in the Van is the story of Black Flag as told from the singer of Black Flag's of Black Flag, and it's like that deep, honest look. I love music documentaries. Like if I had a free hour and they were like, "You want to watch behind the music about a band you've never heard of?" Yes, absolutely, 100%. That's what I want to watch. Any book about music, a book about bands. I think musicians are so interesting, but a lot of those are kind of, I think the word is hagiography, where it's like, well, it's not, it's kind of painted over and it's a little sunshine and roses about certain things. And this is like down and dirty and gritty. We were starving and we were hungry. And I went to the show and the guy was spitting on me. So I punched him in the face and I hurt my hand. And then the next three journal entries are about like how his hand hurts because he punched that idiot. And I'm such an idiot for punching that guy, but also about like how the band dynamic worked and like four people living in a van together, traveling back and forth across the United States, playing tiny little clubs, playing aggressive, angry music. And it's not the happiest book sometimes, but it's so interesting and it's so cool. And I'm a big Rollins fanboy anyway. After he left Black Flag, he started the Rollins band, which I love. And you have absolutely, everybody listening has absolutely heard his voice. At some point, he's one of those guys who does a lot of spoken word stuff, a lot of voiceover work. So if you heard him, you would be like, oh, it's that guy. You've probably seen him in movies. He shows up in movies sometimes. But I just think he's really funny and he's really interesting. When he does spoken word shows, he always calls it spoken word because it's not comedy, even though a lot of his stories are funny. But
Yeah.
he's just telling you stories about the places that he's gone to and the people that he's met. And Rollins is so cool.
It sounds really, because I mean that sounds like something my husband would love because he loves music. I mean he's always been quite particular about the bands that he listens to, but I've watched him go through some big changes just purely from sort of watching documentaries and learning the stories behind bands that previous to that happening he didn't really have a massive interest in, but or just music artists in general, because I think when you love music sometimes like being able to see the sort of craft and story behind music that isn't shown up even when you listen to it is, I think it's very powerful. It's a as someone not musically talented myself, I always find it very interesting. I also find people who keep like diarists and journalists super interesting, because I don't keep one. I've always been really enchanted by the idea of doing it, but some like some of the really famous diarists of history are part of the reason we understand very specific areas. So I find people who keep diaries and then publish them as well, it's an insight into life at that time that you can't really replicate it anywhere. So that seems really interesting. I mean, I'd be interested to know in a couple hundred years time what people might take about America during that period of time from reading journals from
Yeah.
someone driving across it.
And like when I first read the book, I liked Henry, but I didn't like Black Flag because I'm a metal guy first. And Black Flag is very raw and very not what heavy metal is. So I liked him, but I didn't like the band that he was writing about. And it didn't matter. Like I still really enjoyed the book and now I like the band. But it's one of those
Yeah.
bands that takes you a while to like get your head around, I think.
Yeah, like I genuinely think there is like a psychological sort of thing where it's like the sunk costs effect, where when people know how much time and energy and effort and almost like blood, sweat and tears has gone into something, the end product is often valued more. And I actually think that's a really good thing. I mean, my husband did not really consider himself a big fan of Elton John until he watched Rocket Man. So like
That's a great movie. That's how you should make a musician biopic.
yeah, I mean, Taron Egerton is just a gift. He's so good, and Elton John is an excellent thing. But that's off topic. I can completely see how being able to read something like "Get in the Van," and also that's a great name for
It's a great
for a collection of journals. That's a great name. Anything that maybe they should do
just a
into a
great name.
movie. That would be great. It's a
They
great name.
should
It's
do
a
it
great
to a movie.
title. But
And
a
like
great.
reading about, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh no, it's completely fine. I was finished.
Reading about the creative, like you were saying, the creative process is so interesting to me. There's a book on my honorable mentions that is like, I really love getting inside the head of creative people and like poking at why, how, where, how did you do this thing though? Because like I consider myself a creative person, but also like I don't know how it still feels like magic a little bit. Like I want to poke at them and be like, how'd you write that
Yeah.
song though?
Yeah, I always find it really fascinating where people get their inspiration from, because I find like if I sort of have an idea for something, it sometimes can come from the most bizarre and obscure places. Like I'll just be listening to some random episode of some random podcast on a train platform on the way to get from somewhere, and it will like trigger something. And I'm like, but what is that for other people? Because I know why that happens to me, but why does that happen to what brings that on for other people? Like what? And yeah, it's really nice to see. It's good to get an insight from the outside, because it can sometimes seem a little bit like seem like magic from the outside. So yeah, I'm really liking the sort of feel of this list so far. I'm excited to see where you sort of round it off with. What is the fourth book that you'll be taking with you to Maui?
So the fourth book, and I was hesitant to put it on the list because I'm repeating an author, but I couldn't not. It's Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. They wrote it together.
So technically you've got an extra one in there, so it's the same.
Yeah. And it's important for me because it is the first book I read by both of those authors. So it is the book that introduced me to two of my favorite authors of all time. Do you have it back there?
So I have Good Omens on this side over here, and then I have Small Gods this side over here.
Oh.
Yeah. So I'm already almost halfway into reading your list. It's always good when that happens.
It's also I think the only adaptation, because Amazon made a show about it about 3 years ago. It's the only adaptation that works. The show is perfect. They absolutely nailed everything about the book. It's remarkable how well they pulled it off. Plus David Tennant and Michael Sheen are just
David
delightful.
Tennant is just, he's perfect. He should David Tennant is one of those actors that I'm like, I don't know why he's not in more stuff. He should be in more things. He does a lot of stuff on stage, so I know I'm probably like, that's probably one of the reasons why I feel like he's completely underrepresented, but he's so brilliant that I'm like, why is he not in everything?
He's just so much fun.
Yeah, the adaptation looks so good, and but the only reason I haven't watched it yet is because I want to read Good Omens first. I want to read it and then watch it with the full appreciation of everything when I go in. But I'm desperate to watch it. And Michael Sheen also Michael Sheen. He also narrates the audiobook, I think.
Oh, I don't know. I do not have the audiobook.
David Tennant's co-star narrates the new audiobooks. There's a few Good Omens ones, but he narrates the new one, which I would be interested to see as well. Yeah, I love it when someone who's played the character or the person who wrote the book narrates them. But so I mean, again, Good Omens, for anyone who's not familiar, although they did make that film that was loosely based off it, that they called, is it Bad Omens? So they gave it like the opposite name, but it's supposed to be inspired by
I don't know
Good Omens. Okay, I may be making it up, but this is how I heard of I'd heard of Good Omens the first time. I think is it called Bad Omens? Basically, it's about Damien, the child. But it's kind of told as like a horror or something. So it's not.
I think there's a movie called The Omen.
The Omen, yeah. Is that? I thought that was someone once told me that was a bad adaptation.
I don't know.
Good Omens. But either way, for anyone who's not familiar with Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, what is it about, vaguely?
And now there's a small theme, I guess. It's about the end of the world.
There's a sort of biblical apocalypse theme
there is,
sort of running through the list.
Which was an accident. but it's about an angel and a demon, and the end of the world. So the Antichrist has been born, and he is on Earth, and the angel and the demon basically realize we don't want this war between heaven and hell to happen. We need to stop the apocalypse from happening, and it is their adventures to stopping the apocalypse, basically. And the book is beautiful. The show actually does an even better job of fleshing out the relationship between Crowley, who is the demon, and Aziraphale, who is the angel. It turns it into a love story, and it's so good. um and it's just, Pratchett is so silly and has such great ideas, and Neil Gaiman is writes so beautifully and so smart that the two of them working together, just, it creates this incredible alchemy of that. I have heard Gaiman say, you can't tell, like, something that you think I wrote, Terry wrote, and something that you think Terry wrote, I wrote, because the way we were working together just created a synergy between us, I
Yeah.
guess you could say.
What would you give to be a fly on the wall in that room
Oh.
when that was being written?
But so I have a I I remember when Terry Pratchett died. So for the people who don't know Discworld, Death is a character in all of the Discworld books. Death speaks in all capital letters. Death shows up almost any time a character dies, just briefly, but Death has a few books of his own too.
Some
And
of which have been picked on the podcast and
they're wonderful.
recommended. Yeah. Soul Music has come up, as has Mort.
Those are both so much fun. They're so good. But Terry was sick for a long time. He had Alzheimer's, which he called the embuggerment. So we all knew the end was coming.
Yeah. I remember
And
when it happened as well. Even though I didn't have a connection with him as an author,
yeah,
I remember.
I was teaching at the time, and my kids were at lunch or at recess, so it's okay. But I looked at Twitter, and Terry Pratchett's account had tweeted in all capital letters, "Welcome, Terry. It's time to come." And there was like 3 tweets in all capital letters, and I started crying at my desk.
Honestly, I'm trying to not cry at my desk right now, and it's like
And
years later.
it was the perfect, most beautiful way to tell us that he was gone, by using death. But I'm like crying at my desk, and my students come back from recess or lunch, and they're like, "What's wrong with you?" And so rather than doing the next lesson, I did like 15 minutes about, there was this author that you guys don't know, and I did not realize how important he was to me until this moment. I did not understand. And now looking back, every time I was in a low place, every time I felt really sad, I would pick up a Discworld book. I would pick up a new Discworld book. I would pick up an old Discworld book. Those books are really easy to read, so I would read like 2 in a row, and then, okay, I feel a little better, and I didn't realize that I was doing that until he died. So like trying to explain to confused 10-year-olds, my hope for you is that you find an author who makes you feel the way Terry Pratchett makes me feel. And you are, and this sounds sad, but you are this sad when that person is gone.
Yeah.
And even though you've never met them, you will never meet them, you don't know them, but you know them because of their books. It's so, I like when people talk about crying when Bowie died or Prince, like Terry Pratchett is the one that hit me like that. It was rough. And I still can't look at those tweets without getting upset.
I can imagine. I'm almost kind of glad for my own self-preservation that I didn't have the connection with him at the time, because I remember it impacting me even though I'd never read one of his books. And the reason why was because I had childminders at the time who I knew loved Terry Pratchett, and in a way that I did it. I would not have been able to tell you any other kind of book that they read a lot of, but I knew they both loved Terry Pratchett because they had like just books after books of all of them all lined up on their shelves. So when I heard that he'd passed away, I almost felt it for them, because I was like, oh, that's because I think that was one of the first times where it had happened, because either a lot of the authors that I read personally either were still around because they were still relatively young, or I read a lot of classic authors that have been dead for some 100 years. So don't have to worry too much about that. So yeah, it's always impactful when, you know, someone famous or a celebrity or an author, when they have that impact on you, because it is someone you've never met. It's a purely emotional connection that you've created with like their work. And yeah, and I always find, especially someone as fabulously brilliant as creative like Terry Pratchett, because there's always what else was there, because when someone produces such amazing things, it's kind of almost kind of selfishly, but it's like this, it feels like it's endless.
What
And
did we get robbed of? Yeah.
yes, what didn't happen, basically. So yeah, it's really one. And I mean, Good Omens is probably I don't know if it's one of the more famous ones actually, but it's definitely one I had heard the most of. And Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett as a creative team, I mean, they're both titans in their own right, so putting them together is almost shouldn't work. They're almost both too good that it shouldn't work with them both together, but it does.
I think if I remember correctly, it was at the very beginning of both of their careers. So they weren't Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. They were just like two British guys writing a book together. What was nice about it, though, just because you said what else was left, he wrote, there are so many Discworld books. I have not read them all. So it is kind of nice that he was so prolific that
Mm.
it almost feels like you can't run out of Terry Pratchett books. It's like that with
Yeah.
Asimov, too. The man wrote so many books that, like, you're never going to read all of his books.
Yeah, I feel like that is always sort of like, I suppose, a side effect. I mean, on the very flip side of that, I once heard an interview from some journalist who they were saying that Douglas Adams was their favorite author because they loved the books that he did publish. But one of the big losses that they felt was, because Douglas Adams had such horrendous problems with writer's block, he actually gave up writing quite early on in his life because he couldn't deal with the writer's block, that thing. So he just decided to stop writing after he'd gotten so many books in. And then towards the end of his life, he'd started getting ideas again and felt like he could start again. And he'd started writing ideas down, and then he died. And a lot of books that he had sort of started percolating on never got written. And it this sort of journalist was saying, you know, that if they were going to pick someone, you know, the living or dead, who could you have dinner with, that would be their pick, because he wanted to be able to speak to Douglas Adams and see what else there was. So on the sort of, so yeah, like I say, it's good that Terry Pratchett, you can't run out, and there just seem like there is so many. I love his style of book cover as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that about Douglas Adams. That's a huge bummer. That's so
Yeah.
sad.
Another very another very brilliant British writer. It's just these British guys. Was Douglas Adams? Yeah, he was. He was British. I was like, was he American? Have I made that
No.
up? But yes. But Good Omens is one that I think I started reading it, but I was probably a little bit too young to fully
Mm-hmm.
appreciate the style of writing. But I know, having sort of dabbled with Terry Pratchett now, that I'm probably ready for it now. My mind is ready for it in a way that it wasn't
That's a book that
before.
I would always recommend. Like, what should I? Good Omens. Read Good Omens, and then you are given a gateway to two brilliant people who have just incredible wealth of
Yeah.
stuff to read.
Amazing. So we're at the fifth and final book already. So what is the last book that you will be adding to this biblical apocalypse of books that also has a little bit of heavy metal sort of in the middle?
This one is the most recent book, and it is. I think it's technically a children's book or a young adult book, but it's called Ghost by Jason Reynolds.
No.
And it is I'm reading it to my class right now. Actually, I'm about to finish the last chapter on Monday. I've read it to my kids, I think, ever since I discovered it 3 or 4 years ago. So, Ghost is about a young black boy named Castle Crenshaw who is in middle school. He's like in eighth grade, seventh or eighth grade. I don't know what that translates to for you.
I should know by now, but I don't. It's
He's 13, 14 years old.
okay, so yeah, middle high school. It's like year 9.
And what is so it starts out, and the first chapter just sets up Ghost perfectly. It's told first person from Ghost, and he is constantly, it is all about the story that we tell ourselves and the lies that we tell ourselves. So he is constantly like, yeah, because I play basketball. Well, I mean, I don't actually play basketball, but if I ever got a chance to play basketball, I know it would be great, but I don't play basketball. And, people call me Ghost. Well, actually, nobody calls me, I call myself Ghost, but nobody calls me Ghost. And so it's like that kind of thing where he is constantly creating a narrative for himself to protect himself from the reality. And the reality is, and we get this at the end of the first chapter, and it's kind of this fun, silly, funny guy, like you like him right away as he's telling you this story. And then at the end of the first chapter, he drops this bombshell that 3 years ago his mom woke him up and pulled him out of his bed, and they had to go running towards the door because his dad was drunk and pulled out a gun and started shooting at them. And that's the end of the first chapter. And suddenly you understand, oh, Jesus Christ, there's like so much going on in this kid's life. And now his dad is in jail. His mom works all the time. She works at a hospital in the cafeteria. He is constantly getting in trouble in school. He talks about how he feels like he has black and red inside because he just feels angry all the time. And he's still telling himself lies. And he happens upon, kind of randomly, this track team practicing. And he's like sitting and watching these guys, and he's telling himself this story still about, well, they're not that fast. I'm faster than those guys. I can run. I've been able to run since my dad shot at me. So I know I'm fast. Mm-hmm. And so he joins a sprint. Like he just kind of walks onto the track, and the coach tells him to get off, and he ignores the coach, and he does 100-meter against their fastest guy, and he almost beats him. And the coach is like, Jesus Christ, kid, who do you run for? And then the coach like takes him under his wing and lets him join the team. And I'm just going to tell you like a bunch of the big parts of the book. Spoiler alert.
Okay. Spoiler alert is here. You've been warned.
So he makes, because it's so good, and I just need people to read it. It's so good. So he makes it onto the track team, but he doesn't have any money. His mom doesn't have it. They're poor, and he's always in trouble. And eventually what happens is he's like, my shoes are terrible. So he goes to a sporting goods store and he steals a pair of shoes. And he gets away with it. And he lies to everybody about where he got the shoes from. And about 3/4 of the way through the book, when I'm reading it to my class every year, I stop and I'm like, okay, every book has a protagonist, the person who solves the problems, and an antagonist, the person who causes the problems. Who is the antagonist of Ghost? And like he talks about, in the book, he talks about, well, Brandon Simmons is this jerk kid who's always mean to me in school, and this girl laughed at me. So the kids are trying to name those characters. And I'm like, but did those people ever do anything to him? And they're like, well, no. So what are the problems in the book? Well, he gets into fights at school, and he stole those shoes, and he lied to his coach, and he lied to his mom. Okay, so who's the antagonist of Ghost? And they're like, Ghost? Is Ghost the... Wait, he's the main character. The main character can't be the bad guy. of the story. And I'm like, yes, he can. That's what's so great about this book is the main character, the guy telling you the story. He is the problem. He is creating every problem in his life. And then the arc of the story is Ghost finally being able to understand and accept him. So he doesn't like get over the trauma of his dad shooting at him or anything like that, but he becomes honest about it. And he finds friends. And like, it's interesting because there's a principal in the book who, from a kid's perspective, you're like, this principal's being mean to him. But from an adult perspective, you're like, this principal is giving him every opportunity. This guy is being so patient and nice. And it's same with the coach is doing everything he can to help Castle. And Castle and Ghost is the same character.
Yeah.
That has been confusing.
Yeah.
So the end of the story is like him accepting that and finally feeling like he is a part of his team and finally feeling like he is not full of red and black anymore. And it is just, it's funny and it's fun, but it is also like so heavy. And it is so much fun to like watch the kids at certain, like when he makes the decision to steal his shoes, like even the kids who aren't really paying attention are like, wait, what? He's stealing? No, he's the main character. Main characters don't do stuff like that. And it's the first of 4. There are 3 other books in the track series that go over other characters that are on his track team. Jason Reynolds is he's a magician. He's so good. I want to meet him and like shake his hand and be like, you wrote the best read aloud that I read to my class every year. You're incredible.
Well, it sounds like a great book to also introduce to kids, I suppose, at that age, because I mean, even when there isn't sort of a background of trauma and that sort of thing, I think one of the most kind of mind-blowing things that I learned probably far too late really was the difference between living at cause and living at effect. Like living like all the things that happen to you are out of your control and therefore you can't do anything about them, and then being able to take the power into your own hands and even when things are difficult, make choices that help yourself instead of make things more difficult. And I think having, I suppose, that the main character be that sort of first person's perspective of, oh, maybe I should lean into this help that I'm getting from all of these adults in my life that want the best for me, even if I don't see it, is a great premise and a great sort of story. And yeah, it's a great book to have in the classroom as well. I can imagine it's
so good.
That's
and I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I love the way it makes the way the book ends makes my students so angry, and it's perfect because then we get to have a conversation about like, well, what is the real problem in the story? So what should the real solution in the story be? And is the ending satisfying or unsatisfying? Because you expected a certain thing and you did not get it.
Yeah.
But what you got instead was better.
You're giving them the Game of Thrones final season lesson in life that sometimes things don't end the way you pictured them.
Except this ending is good.
Yeah, well.
I honestly, I didn't watch the last season of Game of Thrones because there was so much negativity about it. I was like, I don't know if I want to sit through this.
I didn't watch Game of Thrones, so I just know it from a completely unbiased third party. I read the books, and then when the TV show overtook the books, and I was like, I'm not gonna watch it. I was just like, I just decided against it, and also it's a big commitment. I was like, I don't think I've got that many hours.
I read, I think the first 3 or 4, and then I realized George is never going to finish these books. And I am not going to waste my time reading a series that is never going to end.
So I read 4 or 5, but I was like, I don't think I can commit to all the hours the TV show requires me to commit. So I was like, we've basically got the gist of the story. But either way, back to that, I think it sounds like a really great book, and I think it's always great when an author, especially an adult author, can actually really capture the voice of a young narrator, because you sometimes find with, I suppose, young adult or middle grade or whichever, like books aimed at younger readers, it is sometimes difficult for some authors to emulate in an accurate way the way someone that age would speak, because they've obviously already matured past that, and there's and it can sometimes feel like it's not quote unquote air quotes good writing, because you're moderating the sort of, where like another author that's really good at that is like Rick Riordan. Can,
Yeah.
when he writes in the Percy Jackson books, he sounds like a 12-year-old would tell that story, but it's still in interesting writing. So it's always good to hear that there are other authors out there that are just like telling that first person narrative.
It's kind of, because the first book I normally read to my students is Matilda, because it's such a fun book.
Yeah.
And like there's a ton of voice, I can really get into the voices when I do Matilda. And then when I read this, I tell the kids at the beginning, like, almost all these characters are black. I am not, you know how I did voices for Matilda? I'm not doing that for this. So don't be looking for it. Okay. That'll be a problem.
Yeah, this isn't. Yeah, I suppose if it's told from first person perspective as well, then I suppose a lot of it could just be in one voice anyway, because of the main narrator. So yeah, all great.
It's such a fun read aloud.
It's great. I love hearing about books that have been, like, different kinds of books that are being taught at school as well, because it's nice to hear a refreshing change from. There's like 5 books that get taught in British schools, and they're all the same, and some of them aren't very good. So it's nice to hear that new books are being used.
Trying. You know, it's one of those books that, like, if certain parts of the country found out that I was reading that book to my students, they would be like, "You're indoctrinating your students and you're a terrible person." And I would be like, "Yes." Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You have no idea how right you are. In fact,
I recently went into my old secondary school, and I was in an English classroom, and I was looking around at the boards, and I remembered an English teacher being there when I was there, and I knew she didn't work at the school anymore. She was an English teacher that was very formative in my reading thingy. She put books in my hands that I still love, and was a big part of my sort of development as an English teacher, but I knew she didn't work at the school anymore. And I was looking around the classroom, and I was like, this feels like that teacher's classroom. I was looking at the boards. They were the books she liked to teach. There was a poster that says it's not illegal to think yet, and a few other provocative comments, which were very sort of her brand of teaching. And I came away, and I knew someone else who worked at the school currently, and I was like, who is in that classroom? Because I felt like it was her. And they said, oh yeah, no, we've the new teacher who is in there hasn't redecorated. That's still all of her thing. But even so, I walked into that classroom, and she never taught me in that classroom. That was never the classroom that I knew, but I knew. I was like, I looked and I was like, this is her. I was like, I could just see it just on the boards, and I can imagine your classroom probably has a similar feel.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, in 7 years' time, your students could walk around that classroom and they'd still know it was yours. But yeah, I think that's great. All the best teachers have that opinion, I think, to teaching. But so those are your 5 books. You mentioned some of your honorable mentions. What books almost made it but didn't?
So I have 3 honorable mentions. Is that okay?
Yes, that's good.
I'm not going to go like super detailed.
I have had like double digits of honorable mentions in the past.
Hard.
So 3.
So hard.
So yes, 3 is fine.
The first one actually goes back to that getting inside of the mind of a creative thing that we were talking about. Yeah. It's the biography of Jim Henson, the guy who created the Muppets.
Oh, Jim Henson, the most lovely man.
Yes, by Brian J. Jones. It is the best biography I've ever read. The insight that Brian got into Henson, and he got into all of the archives and talked to everybody, and it is such a cool look at how brilliant and ahead of his time Jim Henson was. Um, and then, you know, there's the chapter. It was so this is how much I enjoyed the book. I was like 2 chapters into it, and I was like, I wonder if this author is on Twitter. And he is. So like every other chapter now, I'm like tweeting at him, I love this book. I love this book so much. You're incredible. This book is amazing. And I'm like trying to tell people on Twitter, you need to read this book, Jim Henson by Brian J. Jones. It's amazing. And then it gets to the chapter about Henson's death. And I'm like, I hate you so much. Why are you so mean? This is, oh my God, I'm crying over Jim Henson. And it's not like I didn't know he was going to die. I knew that, like, it's not a surprise, but still, like, how dare you kill him in your book? You awful, awful man. But it's full of pictures from the Henson archives, and it is just this great look into the mind of someone who I still don't think society has recognized as the level of genius that he was, and the level of just ahead of his time, out of this world that he was. He was so important.
Yeah, definitely. So I have had limited exposure to Jim Henson's works, which I really need to remedy. I need to do that with a lot of things, but I have a appreciation of his talents from big fan of Geek History Lesson podcast. They are big lovers of Jim Henson over there,
Love
Ashley and Jason.
Ashley and Jason, they're so good.
They are so good, and they love Jim Henson, and they talk about him a great deal on their podcast as well, in their Muppet episodes and so on. So yeah, that is a great recommendation that I'm probably gonna have to pick up as well, just because I would like to learn a little bit more about him as well. What were your
and then just a shout out? No,
No.
a shout out to Brian. After I had read the book, he responded to my tweets, which I was like, that's crazy. Authors don't respond to you on Twitter. But like, we became Twitter friends, not like friends, but Twitter friends.
Yeah, Twitter friends.
And my students were writing biographies about famous people. And I sent him a DM, like, my kids are doing biography projects. If it's possible for you, and I totally understand if you can't, would you be willing to Zoom into my class or Google Hangout into my class and talk to my kids for a half hour about what writing a biography is like? No pressure. Please don't. I feel like I am invading the little friendship that we have just by asking. And he got back to me immediately. Give me a date. Tell me when.
That's
and
amazing.
He did it. He's done it 2 years now, where he is 45 minutes, talked to the kids, answered their questions. He's the kindest. I can't say enough good things about him. He wrote a Dr. Seuss biography that is excellent. The only reason the Henson one is on my list and the Seuss one isn't is because I think the Henson one is a little bit better, but they're both great.
Could be the subject. If you're close,
I love Dr. Seuss too, though. But
fair enough.
I think it's not a recency thing, but the first thing that you're exposed to by a person is sometimes,
absolutely.
Oh, well, that's their best album because that's the first one I heard.
Yeah, my husband has that bias for the Dookie album by Green Day. Okay, yeah. I mean, you've just made me. I want to read all of his books now because we like to support lovely people doing lovely things. That's amazing to give time so generously, especially to students, because I just think it's great. So yeah, and you've got 2 more honorable mentions.
Yes. So the next one is, because I had to pick one, The Drawing of the Three by Stephen King, which is part of the Dark Tower series. Because if I could have, I would just put the whole series on the list. But if I had to pick one, it's The Drawing of the Three. And that is the one where our main character, Roland, meets his quartet. He pulls in people from the other. This is going to sound insane without context. He pulls in people from the other world into his world, and they journey with him for the rest of the series.
Yeah.
On his journey to the Dark Tower.
Yeah.
And the reason Drawing of the Three, I think, is the best of the series. They're all great. Even people don't like some of the later ones. I think they're all really fun and really good. Um, but the meta reason it goes on the list is because when my wife and I were first dating, one of the things we connected with first was, hey, before I go to sleep, I like to read. Is that okay with you? And she was like, I brought a book. Yes, absolutely. You read? Yes. And then this series is the first series where I read The Gunslinger. I read the first one and I was like, this is really good. You should read it. And gave it to her and she read it. And that we read the entire series that way. And that was like one of the first series where we like connected on something and it was new for both of us. Neither of us had read it. And then, so the main character's name is Roland. And when she was pregnant with our first child, you have the what are we going to name the kid? And we were hippie weirdos who didn't find out the gender. We didn't want to know until they were born. So we had to come up with a boy name and a girl name. And we were like, well, what should the boy name be? And I think she said, what about Roland? And I was like, yes, done. We're done. That's it.
Amazing.
His name is going to be Roland if it's a boy. And he's a boy. So our first son, our first kid is Roland because of these books.
Oh, that's lovely. I love that. See, my husband is not a reader. I really wish he was because I keep on trying to pitch book-related names for potential children, child names, and doesn't quite. But that's so lovely. I love that, and yeah, that's a great way to bond over a series. I've been told that the Dark Tower series is perhaps somewhere to start, maybe with Stephen King for me, because I've been told I probably like that best because I'm a bit of a baby when it comes to horror. So
me too. I don't like horror books. It took me
yeah.
6 months to read it because I had to stop every half chapter and be like, yeah, it's too scary. I don't like it.
But yeah, that's a really great sort of story behind that series. That's great. And last honorable mention.
And the last one is connected to that one. It's Coraline by Neil Gaiman, which is, I think, my favorite Neil Gaiman book. I'm going to be a bummer again, I guess.
It's
When
okay.
our third child, when she was pregnant with our third child, again, we don't want to know the gender until born, so we had to come up with a girl name and a boy name. And I was like, what about Coraline? Because we both love that book. Mm-hmm. Yes, perfect. So a daughter's name is going to be Coraline if she's a girl. And she was born and she's a girl, but she had a heart defect when she was born. So she went basically straight to NICU for a week. And we lived in the hospital for a week with her in NICU. And it was the worst thing that has ever happened. Like, she's fine now. The NICU nurses everything turned out great, but it was the worst week.
Yeah.
Ever. And you're just sitting in this room trying to think of anything to do rather than listen to the machine beep. We live in Portland, and there's Powell's bookstore here, which is this giant bookstore. So on the second, I think it was the second night, I was like, I need to go. I need to get out of this room. Went to Powell's, found a copy of Coraline because for whatever reason we didn't have it in the house. Brought it back, and then I would sit next to her little crib thing that they had her all wired into and read the book to her. To like give, because you want to talk to your kid, right?
Yeah.
But when there's tubes coming in and out of them and they're beeping and they don't look like the other two looked a week out, right?
Yeah.
What am I supposed to say? So I read the book. I didn't read the whole book to her, but I read the book to her, and it just kind of helped get through that. That's
really, really beautiful. I can't imagine what that was like. But I could definitely, reading is, a coping mechanism for so many things. And it's beautiful that was able to get you through a very difficult time, and amazing to hear that she's well and happy now. A week, that first week it's meant for other things usually, and especially when I think probably when you've got the point of comparison as well, it can be even harder if that's even possible. So yeah, that's
It was so rough that her first birthday we celebrated the day that she was released from the hospital rather than the day she was born, because we were both like, no, like that was a happy,
yeah,
that'll be a happy day in 3 or 4 years. That right now that's still not a happy
yeah,
day.
yeah, absolutely. And well, I mean, that seems
I'm
like
sorry to end on a bummer.
it's completely fine. I'm to be honest, I've got so much respect for you and your wife being able to wait, because I could not wait when I was pregnant with my son. I was just like, I need to know, I need to plan. Somehow this feels integral to my planning. I don't know why, but I need to know everything. But yeah, it seems like the best place to end what has been a really interesting list. I mean, I didn't ask you, but could you recap your 5 picks just for anyone listening so that they can sort of, I suppose, jot them down if they wanted the names of any of the
Absolutely.
books?
So it's Small Gods by Terry Pratchett, Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, Get in the Van by Henry Rollins, Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, and Ghost by Jason Reynolds.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for giving me your list of books. It's been such a wonderful discussion. I've really enjoyed talking about like books and stuff with you. It would, if people wanted to maybe follow you on Twitter and see you tweet at authors and tell them you both love and hate them at the same time, or anywhere else on social media, where can they find you?
I'm still on Twitter, but I don't use it very much since Musk was like, Nazis are a-okay with me. Um,
Yeah, it might not exist for much longer. I'm always
I,
surprised when I can log in. So
I'm waiting for him to sell it to somebody who might care. Uh, but so I'm on Twitter at the Weird Teacher. And most of my social media right now happens on TikTok because I'm old and I want to ruin the thing that the children like by being a part of it. And I am at just Weird Teacher on TikTok. That's a good place to kind of follow me. And I'm on Instagram at the Weird Teacher, where sometimes it'll be teacher stuff, sometimes it'll be pictures of the kids. It's just that's more for like, more personal stuff.
well,
And then if they are interested, if they think I had good things to say or are interested, I've got a bunch of books out. Most of them are teaching books. If you are a teacher or you are looking to become a teacher, these are books written for you. I've written, my first book is called, is it okay if I go through the books real quick?
yeah, completely fine. I was going to prompt you to do that anyway if you didn't do it
Okay.
by yourself. So
So the first book is called He's the Weird Teacher. And it's not a biography, but it is a look at it's a philosophy, teaching philosophy book. The next book is called The Teaching Text, You're Welcome. And that book is because teachers don't have any funny books. There are no funny books that are written about teaching. And if you've been in teaching very long, you have sat through a presentation or read a book by somebody who is like, I am clearly the greatest teacher who ever existed. And if you want to be a great teacher, you will do the things that I am saying you should do. And they never say that, but they say that. And
yeah.
so the teaching text, You're Welcome, is written from that perspective as like a guy who wrote a teaching book and it got incredibly successful, which my book didn't do. And it went straight to his head. And now he thinks he is God's gift to teachers. And so it's this silly satire about education that I think is really funny.
I have several teacher friends, so I've just got my next few holiday gifts sorted.
And then the next one is the motorcycle book, The Unforgiving Road, which is about a post-apocalyptic motorcycle gang. And it is impossible for me to sell to people because these are all independently published so far, except for the very last one. Because I'm like, hey, you know how you follow me for all my great teacher takes and you really like what I have to say about teaching? How about a book about a motorcycle gang? And everybody's like, I don't understand how those two things, that's not why we listen to you though. So dozens of people have enjoyed that book. tens of people.
There are dozens of us. Dozens.
And then the next book is called A Classroom of One, because I'm trying to narrow my field of people who would be interested in buying my books as small as possible. So A Classroom of One is specifically for people who want to be teachers and becoming student teachers, or people who are mentor teachers, people who take student teachers. And this is a book specifically for them, because being a student teacher and being a mentor teacher is incredibly difficult, but also deeply fulfilling. And there's not really, I think, a book about that. So I wrote that book. And then the last book, the most recent book, is published by Solution Tree, like a real publisher published one of my books. And it is called The Cardboard Classroom. And it is all about being design minded in the classroom. So how do you build stuff and make things and be creative in your classroom while still doing all of the hoops and standards and stuff that we have to do? How can you do both of those things together? And that's what the Cardboard Classroom is about.
Amazing. Well, they all sound like interesting books in their various dimensions. I'm sure post-apocalyptic motorcycle gang will have a market in the listeners of this podcast. I'm positive.
I think it's a really fun book. I want people to read it. I want to write another one eventually.
I will put links to all of the sort of socials that you've talked about, and then also links to all of your books in the podcast description. So if anyone listening wants to buy them, they can get them there. And yeah, so follow Doug in all his places and go and buy his books. And if they listeners want to follow the podcast on social media, you can get it on. I'm also still on Twitter, but I don't really use it anymore. Things do post there automatically, so if you wanted to know when the next episode was out, they'll be posted on there. And then Instagram is at Books to Last Pod, so it's at Books to Last Pod on Twitter and Instagram, and I think probably Facebook as well. And yeah, you can get the podcast anywhere they're found, and also on YouTube. So, Doug, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me your very precious time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, it's been great. I hope you've had a good time.
I've had a great time. I love talking about books. This is great.
Amazing. Okay, well, listeners, thank you so much for listening. Doug, thank you so much for giving your time. And until next time, bye for now.